This podcast is brought to you with the help of listeners like you who choose to support the show via Patreon. A small recurring donation helps me to put the show together. Think of it as a tip jar. For information on how you can support the podcast, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. That's patreon.com/WW2podcast. I'm very grateful to those who already contribute each month. With summer coming, I thought we'd take a look at where to take your family if they want to go and see World War II tanks. What could be better than a summer holiday roaming around Europe, ticking tanks off your tank spotter list? I'm joined by Craig Moore. Craig's website, tankhunter.com, that's tank-hunter.com, is an incredible resource if you want to track down and see Second World War tanks. Not only does it tell you where they are, but it gives you the details on the tank itself. So, Craig, your website is comprehensive. How did you get started tracking down tanks?
My main interest came from my Uncle Sid. He lost his leg in Normandy in Operation Totalize. At 3 a.m., I think a Panzerfaust hit the side of his tank. Everybody died. He crawled out. And unfortunately, the injuries were so bad, he was burnt. And the injuries to his leg was so bad that they had to cut it off. From that, I had an interest in tanks, World War II, went to air shows, went to museums. But then with the family, we went to on holiday. I thought I would be able to look for military places of interest in Europe. And I'd read the magazine After the Battle. And that was good, written in the 70s. And at the back of the book, it showed you where some of the tanks were. I told my wife how wonderful the Ardennes was, very pretty, lots of chocolate and nice beer and waffles and cream. She thought, oh, that'd be good. It's not too far with the kids to travel in the car. So off we went. And I had a list of a few tanks from the After the Battle book. But then I suddenly realised that it didn't give all the information because I kept on tripping over tanks. You drive down one road, oh, look, there's another tank in the middle of the road. Or you drive down a row of trees and there's a tank sticking out looking over the river. Totally unexpected, not in the After the Battle book. And my wife, after the fifth tank we'd found, I think it was the Panther at Wheatfield, suddenly worked out something was not quite right. I hadn't been quite truthful about why I wanted to go to the Ardennes. I then went back later, but this time I did a lot of research trying to find out where all the tanks are, and there's a lot of them. And I gradually on a couple of trips I've gone round and seen all the tanks in the Ardennes area, which is Belgium and Luxembourg. And so I decided all this work to make a website out of it, and that's what was the result with my website www.tank-hunter.com. It started off with a guide to where to find the surviving tanks in the Battle of the Bulge area.
I'm presuming the tanks aren't where they came to rest at the end of the war. They've all been collected up, or are some of them literally where they were left?
Some are, like the King Tiger at Le Glaise. Yeah, I have to apologise for my French and German pronunciations. They're not very good, so I do apologise for that. Yeah, like the Le Glaise, the King Tiger has been moved not too far from where it was rested. The Panther tank at I think Celles, that was knocked out not too far from where it was. But yes, a lot of them have moved, and also a lot of these tanks weren't involved in December and January 1944, 1945. They're there for show. There's a new museum near Bastogne, the Ardennes 44 War Museum, and it's got a Hetzer out the front. That's a Swiss tank, a G13. But it looks good. Some of the other Hetzers, like the one in the Bastogne Historical Centre, that's a Swiss tank, which was made after the war. But they look like the World War II tanks. There used to be a Pershing, M26 Pershing, in La Roche, Ardennes, but that's now been swapped over for a Sherman tank. But it's great to go on holiday and get a sense of what happened in that area. one of the things that I did use to research where all the tanks is Pierre Oliver Bound's fantastic surviving Panzer list. He runs a website from World War One up to modern tanks, and he's compiling that, and that was a great resource to find out where they were.
There can't be that many German tanks. I mean, the tanks survived the war. Presumably, at the end, most of them were taken off as scrap.
Well, most of the industrial nations desperately needed steel, and they were scrapped for steel so they could rebuild after the war. Only a few survived. I mean, the German ones in the Bastogne area, you've got the Panzer IV, which is in the Bastogne barracks. Out in the streets, you've got the Panther at Houfflers. You've got another Panther, Cromwell. Oh, I pronounced that wrong. There's another very, very good-looking Panther out there. But these places, the tanks that are out in the countryside, they're difficult to find. It took a lot of time using Google Maps to try and find the exact location, and then go around the countryside with a sat nav. What I did, I tried to do a website to help people find these tanks when they go on holiday or when they're driving through.
Surreptitiously add you to your list of things to drive past. There's the tank turrets around Bastogne as well, isn't there?
If you're going for the first time, the best place to stay is Bastogne. There is the Bastogne War Museum. That's got a couple of Shermans inside, a 105mm Sherman. It gives you a great history, and it's also got the big war memorial there. That's near the town. Outside to the north of the town, you have the Bastogne Barracks. It is a military base. It's free. The guys show you around the tanks. And what's lovely is that it had the Belgium Army Tank Restoration Centre. It now restores World War II tanks. Whenever you go, there will be a different tank there. And that's another thing about when you go to look for tanks, either in Normandy or Bastogne. And if it's a trip that you're planning some way ahead, take the time to contact the local tourist office and ask them, send an email, ask them, is their tank still there? My last trip, I went to one venue in Luxembourg. We drove all the way there, a couple of hours out of our way, and the tank had gone. No problem, because later on when we went to the Bastogne Barracks, we found that same Sherman. It was being restored. I know, like the Houfflers Panther tank is due to be moved to Bastogne Barracks for restoration within the next couple of years. So be aware that although these things are very, very large and heavy lumps of metal, they do move. To not be disappointed, do your research, use my website, find the location, but then contact the local tourist office and see whether it's still there before you set out.
Is the other concentration of tanks in presumably Normandy, because that's obviously where a lot will have been destroyed. I mean, as a kid, we went on holiday to Normandy, and in pidgin English and pidgin French, the farmer we were stopping with explained to us how his neighbour had a Sherman in the barn that had been left there from the war, or at least that's what we thought he said. There must be a lot in and around Normandy as well.
Yeah, in Normandy, the best place to stay is in Bayeux, because it's right in the centre of the battlefields. To the left of Bayeux, you've got all the American beaches, and to the right of Bayeux, you've got all the British beaches. And there are tanks situated as war memorials all over the place, and there's some very, very new modern museums. The D-Day Rex Museum is very unusual. That's just north of Bayeux. All the tanks look like they're rusty. They were found under the water. And initially, before I went there, I thought, this is horrendous. These things should be restored. They should be undercover. They should be put back to the conditions they were before they left England. Having been there, I realised it's a memorial and an education to the people that lost their lives in the tanks that sank, that never reached the beaches. They've got a couple of duplex drives, Sherman DD swimming tanks. Most people believe that they were a waste of space, they didn't work, because on the American beaches, I think out of 30, only 2 or 3 got to the beach. But that wasn't the same story on the British beaches. Most of them did their job, they got to their beach, they provided cover. Both stories, the ones that sunk and also the ones that survived, come out at this museum. So that is quite a poignant place to go and see what did happen. So I'm now 100%, yes, they should stay in that condition.
Is there many
They got some
Sorry, I was going to say, is there many DDs left?
Surprisingly, there are. There's a DD at one of the seaside ports. Again, my French is going to be awful. Courseulles, sur Mer. That's got a Sherman DD at the front. The skirts are not on there, but the metal boat-shaped ridge where the skirts was and the propellers are there at the back. That's there. Yeah, there are a few DDs around. Obviously, there's the ones at Bovington Tank Museum. Yeah, it's interesting to go and see the things that you read about and actually can go and see them. The other, as you said, the Bayer War Memorial, we were chatting before the podcast, that is a very good start as well. They've got outside the front a Churchill flamethrower, the crocodile tank. They have a Wolverine. They've got a Sherman, but they've got a Hetzer as well, which it's a Swiss Hetzer. It's a G13, but Hetzers were never in D-Day. It looks good. It's painted now rather nicely in unusual camouflage, but it wasn't there during the war. You've got to be prepared. And a couple of other tanks, like there's a EZ8. There's a big 76mm American Sherman tank on Utah Beach outside the Utah Beach Memorial Museum. It looks very, very good. Thing is, they only arrived on the battlefield in late 1944, so they were never used on D-Day. But it looks good. It gives new visitors an idea of what a Sherman tank looked like. There are other tanks out there that weren't in the war, weren't in D-Day, but I think the people are correct in putting them there just so people have an understanding of what happened.
Yeah, and I suspect there's also far fewer people who'll be able to pick them up on the fact that they weren't there and correct them.
Yes. It gives the idea. It's education. It's all about education, new generation, learning about what happened. The reason why I then did the Normandy web page is to help people to find these tanks as well. Because when I went there last year, all the shops, all the tourist offices, there was no book or there's no guide to where to go and find the tanks. I mean, later I'll try and find someone to turn the web pages into a guidebook. But people who are interested in tanks, interested in World War II, they need the help without having to do all the research that I've done to find out where these tanks are and where to find them. And I have tried to give location information because sometimes the address just doesn't work on the sat-navs. So that's why they're all there. Some of the tanks you have to go out for a bit of a drive, but it is worthwhile because one of the most interesting tanks is they have a Tiger tank in the wild. And that is at the Vimouters. Again, I must have murdered that pronunciation. Vimouters, the Tiger tank. And that's down south, just to the right of Falaise. But what's interesting, if you're going, especially going with your family, it's very near Camembert. And if you go there, you must go to the Camembert Museum. But going back to the Tiger tank, it is really impressive. It's outside the town. They put it on a plinth. It is very rusty. There's a big argument about who's going to pay for the restoration going on at the moment. But as you come round the bend going up the hill, there's this whacking great big Tiger tank.
Is it there as a memorial or is it just there as a...
It's a memorial. It's one of the rare surviving original Tiger tanks, and you can touch it. And in some museums, you can't touch the tanks.
There is that thing about the museums. You kind of kept at arm's length in some respects. Then you get these memorials sort of set out in places because they are dotted all over, aren't they? Normandy.
Yes, one of the best ones to go to is the new Overlord Museum and the Normandy Tank Museum. The Overlord Museum is modern construction. It's got things like M10 Wolverines, the Shermans, very, very well done inside, lots of information. The Normandy Tank Museum is to the left, near a place called Catz, C-A-T-Z. Very well done, a huge collection of not only tanks, from Stuarts to Priests to Chaffees. They have vehicles as well. They've got the lorries and everything else that would be part of an armoured division. That's a good day out. And at the back, they've got a restoration centre, although access to the public is not normally open, but you can obviously poke your head round the side and see what's going on.
Shermans must be 10 a penny in all these museums and memorials. Is there are there any sort of variants or is there a holy grail of a tank that's missing out in any of these museums and memorials?
There are lots of them, but then you can look at the different ones. You can tick off boxes to see whether you've got an M4A1 or you've seen an M4A2 or you've seen the Easy 8. What isn't there, they haven't got a Sherman Crab, the flail tank. That would be good in Normandy. A few more of the French tanks that were used for internal security would have been good. What's nice in the Airborne Museum and at St. they've got a fiberglass version of a German-used Renault R35 tank, as if it was involved in one of the battles there with the paratroopers and got knocked out. So that's quite good. Some of the unusual things you've got there is if you go to Dead Man's Corner Museum, which they've now turned into a paratroop centre, they're going to bring out a restored Renault UE armoured transporter. That's one of the unusual things that are going on. Every time you go back to these places, something new is happening. Somebody's done a new restoration, or there's a new museum. So it's a fluid situation, which is good. Every time you go back, there's something different.
Are they still? I was going to say, discovering is probably not the word. Remembering where they left them. Are they? Are the collections increasing? And I don't necessarily mean with ones sold to Israel after the war. Are they still pulling them out from woods and?
No, not to my knowledge. That's more East European or Finland, where in the winter the ice and the rivers were frozen over. Tank would go over it and submerge underneath and be covered in mud. That's not really happening in Bastogne or area or in Normandy.
They're not digging out the tiger that's under the road?
That's in Paris. Yeah, that's the thing that's going on in Paris. There are a few other places where there are wrecks under the water, and they're talking about getting some of those out. But that costs a lot of money, and France hasn't got a lot of money at the moment. And every single wreck that is there is a national monument, is owned by the government, and there are all sorts of ancient monument controls and legislation that cover those things. Not quite so in Eastern European countries.
No, that was going to be my next question. Who owns the wrecks, or when you pull them out, who becomes responsible for them?
Yeah, in Finland, Germany, and France, it's the government, or the army. Yes, some of them get poached. Some people will steal some of the tanks that are found, which is naughty, and people are being prosecuted for that. But there are people that have got wrecks that are getting restored, and there's quite a lot of good restorations going on, which you can see. So
if we move out of Normandy, looking at the rest of Europe, I presume really France, because there was the heaviest tank battles, is the hotspot for it. But does every country have its own national tank museum? Certainly Britain does, but do the Germans look after their old World War II tanks?
If you're interested in going finding tanks, then a road trip to the Battle of Bold Country and Normandy should be top on your list, because then there are around about 50 tanks in each of those areas, and you can have a fantastic 2 weeks holiday. But if you fancy a weekend break to go and see some tanks, I would recommend the German Tank Museum and the French Tank Museum. They have got the most impressive collections that I've been to outside Bovington. The German Tank Museum, it's in a place called Munster, and you have to be very, very careful when you're booking your flight tickets. It's not the big town, the city called Munster. It is a little military town in the middle of Germany, and the best way to get there is by getting a cheap flight to Bremen and then getting the 1 hour train to Munster. And another little tip is try and do your visit on their Tank Fest day. Spend the night in one of the hotels, go to the Tank Fest. The place is packed, crowded. You'll see the tanks moving around. If you want to take photographs, there'll be too many people around on the Tank Fest day. You have a great day, but then next morning, go back to the Tank Museum and there's no one there. But what you have the advantage of is all the tanks that have been used for the display, they are being washed and they are being brought back into the museum. So you get close-up experience of seeing these tanks being manoeuvred, and that was a very good experience. The French Tank Museum is in Saumur, which is on the Loire Valley, and you can go to Paris and then get a train down there. It's also a nice place to take your partner, because Saumur is a gorgeous city, unlike Munster. A gorgeous city, so you can have a nice time trying all the wine, cheese and breads and restaurants, but then you can go up the hill and have a look around the French Tank Museum. It's just south of Le Mans. That's very, very good. There's a lot to see there.
Do they have a national bias in both of them?
The French Tank Museum has got one of the best German displays. They've got a Tiger. They have Tiger 2s that actually work. It's in running condition. They've got quite a lot of self-propelled guns. It's got some of the more unusual vehicles than the German Tank Museum.
I wonder if that's because they were in France and they were left there, whereas by the time the Germans probably took all theirs for scrap, or there was not much left there that wasn't blown to hell and out of it.
That's right. And also French tanks are very hard to find, and they've got a good selection of the French tanks and some very good World War I tanks. Another little day trip if you want. Get the train to Brussels or fly to Brussels, and they have something called the Royal Army Military History Museum. Most of their tanks have gone. They've all been sent off to the Bastogne barracks, but they still have a few very good World War II ones. They've got the Renault FT, they've got a British Whippet, and a British World War I, I think it's a Mark V, I may be wrong on that one. That's there, and they in the central quadrangle they have a few modern tanks, but they have a huge glass conservatory full of old World War I, World War II, and Cold War jets. That was very impressive, as well as having Napoleonic museum displays. You can also, if you're going to the Ardennes, if you're going by train, you could do a stopover and have a couple of hours in that museum before going off to getting the train down to the Ardennes. And that's really worthwhile, a little trip there.
So the other two countries that we forget about, we've not even got to Russia, is Finland and Sweden. For certainly the Finns, it's very easy. They don't get mentioned much certainly in a lot of the history.
Finland was fighting for its life against Russia, and we weren't going to help them. Nor the Americans very much, and so they turned to the Germans. Most of their tanks were German. And they've got a very, very good museum just north of Helsinki. So you can get a cheap flight to Helsinki and then get on the train to Parola, Parola. And that's where the Finnish Army Museum is. But what the Finnish army did is they captured a lot of Russian tanks. And they then used them with their troops. So you see some very, very rare tanks like the T-26, the KV-1, with extendable bolted-on extra armour, as well as a lot of Stug 3s. It's an interesting place to go if you're looking for unusual tanks. The other thing is the Swedish Tank Museum. Everybody thinks, well, Sweden wasn't involved in World War II. But the Swedish Tank Museum, again, cheap flight to Stockholm, you have to hire a car, but it's not too far out. And they have some very unusual vehicles. They've got one of the very few Stug 3 Alst D. I think there's only about 3 of them. John the Welder Phillips is building another one in Kent at the moment, but this is one of the few that's left. They've also got the only original German 1918 World War I tank called the LK2. They call it the M21, left in the world. That's there. There are 2 other ones which had later upgrades called the M21-29. German Tank Museum's got one, and the Swedish Tank Museum's got 1.5. But they've got some unusual French tanks. They've also got their own builds of tanks that they built during World War II, just in case they got invaded. And they got some very early British Carden Lloyd tankettes. It's a very interesting place to go, and they're very, very friendly.
You mentioned captured tanks. It always surprises me when I see captured vehicles repurposed, and I don't know why, because why wouldn't they repurpose them? And presumably most of the French armour got reused by the Germans.
Yeah,
I mean the Marder's a French chassis, isn't it?
There's different ones. Some have got Czech chassis, different versions. But yes, I've just written a load of new articles for Tank Encyclopedia on the Lorraine armoured tractor being converted into an artillery gun. Some of the French tanks were also used for self-propelled artillery guns. The Germans used anything they got. Likewise, the Finns used any captured tanks to convert and to use against the enemy.
I wonder how their crews felt when they were handing did these early French, early war French tanks.
Yeah, I mean, the Finns would have been very happy having a KV-1 because that's got very, very thick armour. Most of the artillery guns, they were designed to fight behind the line, give supporting fire. The other place that, if you're really interested in looking at tanks, is to go to Moscow. Moscow is amazing. It's got 3 big tank museums. You can get cheap flights, but it's a pain to get your visa. But Moscow is very, very attractive to go around all the tourist locations. The Kremlin is very, very good. Just north of the town, you get the metro and you walk up into this nice little park area, and they have the Central Armed Forces Museum. And most of that has Russian armour, Soviet armour. And it has them all in a long line going from pre-World War II tanks like the T-26 and some of the amphibious T-38 tanks, up to the BT tanks, the fast tanks, and then going up to the early T-34s, T-34-85s, and then some of these self-propelled guns like the Su-100s, the Su-152s. And also they've got the only KV-2, that big monster howitzer gun stuck on the top of a KV-1 chassis. And that's the only one original surviving tank at that museum. So just for that tank alone, it's worthwhile going there. If you do go there, please, please, please go and have a meal at the cafe. They've rebuilt the cafe as a Soviet army log cabin in the woods that have been dug in. And all the waiters and the staff are all dressed up as Russian World War II soldiers. And you get given options of either having an officer's meal or a soldier's meal, and it's like pea soup, and it just depends on what you get the cutlery. It's all served in army billy cans and tin mugs, and that was a really brilliant experience. But the other museum is a little bit out of town to the west of central Moscow. It's now called the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War, 1944 to 1945. It has a big memorial museum in the middle. But what's more interesting is around the side, in the woods, you have the Ground Forces Museum. There is also an aviation section, but the Ground Forces Museum, again, covers early tanks, lots of German tanks, and unusually, which most people don't realise, is the Russians were fighting the Japanese, and they have captured a lot of Japanese tanks. So if you want to go and see Japanese tanks out in woodland area, you've got to go there. They have a good selection. Some of the camo paintwork is a bit questionable, but it's nice to see these tanks in the flesh. I think Bovington's only got one, and a little tankette. It's very pleasant to be able to go and see the different type of tanks used in World War II by the Japanese. If you are very interested in Japanese tanks, then if you go on to Pierre Oliver's Surviving Panzerlist Tanks, he has a whole section on the Japanese tanks that survived the war and are out there, and they are all over the place. But if you're very, very into Japanese tanks, then use that as a basis for planning your next exotic holiday. Going back to Russia, the creme de la creme is the Kubinka Tank Museum. Now, that is their main tank museum, but it's outside of Moscow. It's about an hour's railway journey. You go to the Belaruska railway station, get the local train to Kubinka, just goes direct, no hassle, and you get one of the taxis. Don't walk because there's a major motorway you've got to cross. Get one of the local taxis, very, very cheap, to take you to the front door. And yes, you get charged more than the locals, but you earn an awful lot more than the locals. I think it's like you get 16 quid entrance fee, where the locals pay £3. You would go into this place and it is amazing. It is stuffed with tanks from every different nation. Again, here you'll see lots of Japanese tanks, British and American tanks that we sent over in Lend-Lease, as well as every single Russian tank that you can think of. They've got Tiger tanks. They've also got the Mouse. That is another big reason to go to Kubinka, because it's the only surviving giant German Mouse heavy tank left in the world. It's made up of two vehicles. The chassis came from one vehicle and the turret came from another. But that is an amazing place.
Well, they must have had a huge amount of German armour left because of, well, it was just used there on a different scale. And of course, you've got Kursk and everything else. I'm just sort of surprised that so much of it survived. You'd have thought the Russians would be just dragging it in, melting it down and doing other things with it.
I mean, this is their armour proving ground, so a lot of it would have been used for testing. They found a new weapon, a German weapon, let's go and see whether we can break it or not, or can we use any of this technology in our designs. And they also have some Lend-Lease stuff that the British and the Americans sent them for them to have a look at and study and copy, because a lot of the early Russian tanks copied pre-war British designs. That'll upset a few people, but you have a look at them. And there's records of senior officers coming over to up north to have a look at our at Vickers and looking at some of the early war designs there. Moscow is a very, very good place to go. If you can, then take a trip up to St. Petersburg. You can get the fast train there. I think it's 4 hours now. It used to be an 8-hour journey, but 4 hours you can go up to St. Petersburg, and they have the artillery museum there, and that's very good. But check the opening days. It's not open every day of the week, and they've got a lot of the self-propelled guns and the self-propelled howitzer guns there.
And here in the UK, we've got the Mecca in Britain is Bovington.
Bovington is superb. It's huge. It's got lots and lots and lots and lots of tanks. Bit out of the way if you have to go by train. The other places you can go to is the Imperial War Museum in London. Now, that is disappointing at the moment because they've done a total revamp, and whereas it used to be stuffed with tanks, they've shipped them all off to Duxford.
See, I've not been since it was redone, annoyingly. You used to walk through the door, didn't you, into the big main sort of atrium bit, and they were all there. It's fabulous.
It was. But I know why they've done it. They want to encourage children to come there, so they've built it around the school's curriculum. There's lots on the home front in the Blitz. There's lots on the communist uprisings, Hungary. The T-34-85 is still there because it covers that. They've got a new World War I section. They've got some dioramas, and they've got a few World War I tanks there. They've got one Sherman left there. But most of the, things like the Jagd Panther and the other tanks have been moved away. So that's why I would then recommend going to the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. That is a very good. Now they've got Monty's M3 tank there, and they've got Cromwell tanks, Grizzly tanks, special engineering tanks. Very worthwhile trip. Now, if you live more to the southwest in North Devon, I would really recommend going to the Combatant Combat Collection near Barnstaple. It's run by Tim Isaac and his father. They've got huge hangars, look like old army or RAF hangars, and it's stuffed with all sorts of military equipment, weapons, and they have some odd tanks, Russians, Cold War tanks, World War II tanks. They've got a paratroop glider in there. It is a good boys' day out and girls' day out, and you can actually touch the tanks.
Is that a private collection?
Yes, they've got a few rare tanks. They've got quite a few of their tanks work, actually. They've got a Sexton self-propelled gun there that works. They've got one of the rare, so I'm just trying to find it, D-Day Centaur vehicles, which were used by the Royal Marines to provide covering fire as they came into the beaches. They've also got one of the tanks, the Shermans that we used in the film Fury. It's got a replica turret on at the moment because it was the one that travelled behind the Fury tank and got the turret blown off. But that's there. They've got a good selection of interesting armoured fighting vehicles that you will have a good day's out.
Talk about armoured fighting vehicles. It surprises me is how few of the half-tracks and stuff survive. And again, like you were saying, what you see is not always what you see, as a lot of the half-tracks that we see, the German ones, are actually converted Czech ones. I wonder how many of these collections actually have post-war models, or even if it's made, people are made aware that they're actually a post-war model or something that was shipped to some front that was never used.
I mean, a lot of our World War II stuff was shipped to other countries. Like we sold a load of stuff to Portugal, and then they came back. Some of the tank collectors went over to Portugal and brought them back. That's where a lot of our Shermans came from, and also our Sextons. It gives the impression of World War II, even if it's not the actual real thing that fought in the war. It's good to educate people.
Is there a difference between the private and public collections in the way they're presented?
Money. If you've got lots of money, you can make something very, very slick like Bovington. But some of these guys, their only income is from visitors to the front door.
I sometimes think some of the private collections are better because they're less because they're not quite so worried about people touching the tank.
Yeah, I mean, the Combatant combat collection is one such example. You can touch things, you can measure things, you can have a really good involvement with the weapons there, and you are closer to the weapons rather than being held back behind a line. Another good one is in Norfolk, the Muckleborough military collection. When I first went there, that was quite basic, but now obviously they've got income through visitors' numbers, and they've made that more buildings, much a slicker environment, but they've got a good collection there. And another one near you is in North Yorkshire is the Eden Camp Modern History Theme Museum. That's got Churchill, Sherman's, Soviet T-34-85s, which probably came from Czechoslovakia. Other ones in the Midlands, the newly opened military, the Wheatfield military collection at Donington Racetrack.
Is that a spin-off of the Wheatcroft collection?
Sorry, the Wheatcroft, not the Wheatfield, but the Wheatcroft collection. It's next door to the Grand Prix F1 museum. That's got a lot of military armoured fighting vehicles, as a Churchill Crocodile tank. It's got a Sherman there. It's got a Hetzer there.
Is that Kevin Wheatcroft's whole collection on display?
No. He's got a yard where he does restoration. This is only part of his collection. This is the first time he's opened it to the public, apart from the open days at the military events.
Isn't he the biggest collector of World War II bits and pieces? Private collector.
Private collector. He's got the biggest yard with stuff, but it'll keep him going for years, the amount of wrecks that he's got to restore. But that's not open to the public. You also find tanks in unusual places. Like, for example, in the Midlands, there's a place called Armageddon Paintball. Now, we've all heard of paintball, running around the woods and getting hurt with paintball bullets being fired at you. But this place, they have Cold War armoured personnel carriers with turrets made to fire giant paintballs. I think they've got 13 of them, which is great fun. But by the side, they have a tank museum, and they have a collection of Cold War tanks, and they've got some World War II tanks. I know they've got a 105mm Sherman at the moment. And another one up north is the Durham National Railway Museum, which seems a rather strange place to go and see tanks. It's the only place in England where you can see a Crusader Mark I. There are Crusader Mark IIIs at Bovington, but this early Crusader is stuck on the back of a flat loader to show people what happened during World War II, how tanks got transported around the country. So you can find tanks in very unusual places. Do
you have a favourite of all of them? Or is it dependent on what's in it as opposed to the...
I like rarity value and finding something new, or something surprise you and go, wow, or something unusual. I mean, things like the Matilda 1 at Bovington. That thing fought against Panzer IIs. How the hell did and Panzer 38s? Some of the unusual things like the Churchill AVRE tanks with a great big mortar thing on the front. It looks like the flying
Bigot mortar,
yeah. I like some of the older tanks and the history of the tanks. So like the Vickers Medium or the cruiser tanks, some of the very old tanks, especially as they relate to some of the things my family were involved in. Some of my uncles were in the desert, and these were the vehicles that he would be fighting along. The Vickers Mark VI tank, which you can see at Duxford and the French Tank Museum, they are very, very strange looking tanks. But again, they were out in the desert. Other places you can see tanks are obviously the big shows that are on. You've got the North Yorkshire Military Vehicle Show, the War and Peace Show down in Kent. You've got mill tracks in Holland, in Overloon. Most of the big tank museums, French Tank Museum in Saumur and the German Tank Museum, they have big open days. And if you like seeing tanks moving and other armoured fighting vehicles moving under their own steam, then they are the places to go.
Yeah, they're impressive, and especially, I mean, if you see them at War and Peace, some of the mock battles are quite nice, just because you see them moving in some form of context with other things.
That's another thing. There are some very, very good tank museums all over America and Australia. There's normally a military museum somewhere, or some tanks on gate guards. Use the Surviving Panzer List website to try and find some of the more exotic locations.
Of course, there's gate guards as well, and there must be a lot of those,
especially in America. Also, like a veterans meeting huts, they normally have a tank sitting outside it. One of the unusual places in England is the Cromwell tank memorial in Norfolk. That's sitting along the side of the A1065, about a mile north of the village of Ickborough in Norfolk. Driving along the road in the woods, and bang, on the top of this yellow brick plinth is a Cromwell tank, a memorial to the 8th Army. And it's like when you go to Normandy, some of the memorials are in the middle of nowhere. The Hill 112, Churchill, it is in farmland. It's a slight raised hill, and you go along the road, it's hidden by trees, and suddenly, bang, there's this Churchill tank. You get a little bit of a kick out of suddenly sort of coming across an armoured fighting vehicle where you don't expect to see it. Some of them are really, really hidden, and it's really hard to find them. Like, for example, Patton, when he went over there, he had to be a bit quiet, not to tell the Germans where he was staying. So there's a place, a command centre, and it was in an apple orchard, hidden by trees, and it's out of the town centre. It's called Camp Patton Nehou, I'm again pronouncing it wrong, Nehou. You set your sat-nav to the village, and there's no tank. And you ask them where it is, and they send you to a tiny little village down the road, and at a crossroads. And you then have to go half a mile further down the road, and suddenly there's this tank in the middle of nowhere. You need to do a lot of research when you go to some of these tanks, which is one of the reasons why I set up the tankhunter.com website. I will get around to writing the book one day so people can take something with them in the car.
Yeah, a physical copy of all the information on the website would be great to have in the car driving around. So keep us posted on that one. Thank you, Craig. That was brilliant. For you, our listener, I'll post a comprehensive list on the website of all the places Craig has talked about, www.podcast.com, or you can visit tank-hunter.com. That's it for this episode of the show. Don't forget, if you enjoyed it and found it useful, why not become a patron on Patreon? That's patreon.com/WW2podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.